Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Finally, there's a renewed effort to declassify 28 pages of the 838-page congressional report on the events of 9/11. It's all about the role of some Saudi officials and others who may have been involved. We've been told repeatedly the pages are damaging. Should we be surprised? After all, it is said Riyadh supports radical ideologies and groups around the world. To CrossTalk, the classified 28 pages, I'm joined by my guest, Larry Johnson in Washington. He is a managing partner for Berg Associates and a former CIA analyst and a U.S. State Department counterterrorism official. In Oxford, we have Oliver Miles. He's a former British ambassador, as well as editor of the Arab Digest newsletter. And in Burlington, we cross to Eric Zuesse. He's an investigative historian. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Larry, if I can go to you first in Washington, D.C., we've known the existence of these censored 28 pages since 2003. We had Senator Graham that has been pushing, former Senator Graham, that's been pushing for its release ever since then. And remarkably, we have a bipartisan agreement that these documents should be released to the public. The Obama administration, like its predecessor, the Bush administration, refused to. Why now? Why are we talking about this now? Why is it the headlines around the world? Go ahead.
Probably the most, I guess, significant cause in this is the drop in the oil price, with Saudis no longer in the dominant position as they were during the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, and that their oil money could buy them love and happiness and anything else. They've certainly bought a lot of people in D.C. That now that influence has waned. And at the same time, there is sort of, we've seen in America the rebirth of this desire for authenticity and getting to the facts. It's been one of those truths that's been staring everyone in the face. We've known from the beginning 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. We've known that the Saudis have been providing money to terrorist organizations for years, not maybe as an official government policy per se, but certainly people who had connections with the government were endorsing it. So this is, I think it's important for it to come out, but it's certainly going to damage U.S.-Saudi relationships.
Okay, Oliver, if I can go to you in Oxford, I would say that the relationship is already damaged. I mean, we can see that the United States has been giving cover to Saudi Arabia for disastrous foreign policy initiatives in Syria and in Yemen, and it's a relationship with Turkey and Israel. I mean, it's a very toxic mix right here, and the United States is finding itself not being able to control very much on the ground. Go ahead, Oliver.
Well, I'll have to pass on these documents because I don't know the inside story, but it's part of an ongoing problem that Saudi Arabia's faced right from the very beginning. And when I say the beginning, I'm going right back 100 years or so. There's always been a problem in Saudi Arabia in that the Saudi rule is based on an alliance between the Saudi family and the so-called al-Sheikh, the religious family who started the Wahhabi movement. But at the same time, there's always been a conflict between the Saudi rulers and the Islamic extremists who've wanted to drive them in a direction they don't want to go. King Abdulaziz, back in the 1920s, had to fight these people and win. And they've bitten back from time to time over the years, and they're still there.
Okay, Eric, the Saudis have come back and said that it's blackmail. Let's just say what it is, okay? $750 billion in securities and other assets they will withdraw. Number one, a country that is experiencing austerity on the one hand, but having huge military expenditures on the other hand. I mean, how do you take them seriously? Go ahead.
Well, I think that the first thing that has to be said about this is that the person who had been the bag man for Osama bin Laden and who had collected every one of the $1 million plus donations, all of them in cash, that were made to al-Qaeda and that were then paid out by al-Qaeda as salaries, and he called them salaries. The bag man himself referred to them by using that term and said that they were paid very, very well. for their services. The people whom he named in a sworn court testimony in the United States, which was the only incident where he was released from his maximum security obscurity. Okay, the people who supplied virtually all of those $1 million plus donations were Saudi princes and a few of their business associates, their chief business associates. He named in his testimony about 8 of them, 8 Saudi princes. These included Prince Talal, Walid Talal, and Prince Bandar, who at the time of the 9/11, of course, was the ambassador, the Saudi ambassador in Washington. It included Prince Turki. It did not include Prince Salman, the current Prince Salman, but he did mention the current Prince Salman in another context, supporting Al-Qaeda and supporting.
Okay, let's put this in the context here. Hang on here, Larry. If I can go to you here. I mean, what this bill that is being talked about in Congress is to allow the Saudi government to be sued by people that are families of the victims of 9/11 here, and Obama is resisting this very, very strongly, publicly and privately here. I mean, he's chosen a foreign government that has done the U.S. basically no favors. When it comes to values in the world, if I can use that term, over the American people. In my opinion, that's impeachable. Go ahead, Larry.
Well, I don't think it's impeachable, but I do think what you're seeing is it didn't start with Barack Obama.
Okay.
The provision of Saudi money to buy a variety of people and to buy influence and to buy access, it's been underway for at least 40, 50 years. We've seen of late, what's really transpired is it was the U.S. intervention in Iraq, taking out Saddam Hussein, allowing the Shia majority to become in charge, and then the spread of Iranian influence in the region. This has alarmed the Saudis. The Saudis, from their standpoint, look to the United States as being willing to do the Saudi bidding. For example, John Brennan, the current head of the Central Intelligence Agency, he was the chief of station in Saudi Arabia back in 1995. And they fully anticipate and expect that the United States would help the Saudis act in their interests, which is to counter Iran. And we've seen almost a schizophrenia on the part of the United States on this policy front. Sometimes we appear to be backing the Saudis and other times not. So it is within this context that the members of Congress can, they're not really thinking about foreign affairs. What they're thinking about is the storyline is simple. There were Saudis who got money from Saudi princes who killed Americans, and they need to pay.
Okay, and actually that's a coherent narrative for a change in American foreign policy, at least for the American citizenry. Oliver, if I can go to you here. We're talking about I would say a very toxic relationship. I'm reacting to what Larry said. I mean, sometimes working in the interests of the Saudis and sometimes against. I mean, what is America's role in all this? Because, as Barack Obama is in Riyadh, and the perception is he's being led by the Saudis. Why?
I don't find it surprising that America should sometimes support Saudi policies and other times not. After all, their interests are not identical. If you take the question of Iran, America has gone through a terrible period in its relationship with Iran. It's been poisoned by the events of a generation ago. It's taken America a long, long time to draw back from the emotional impact of what happened a generation ago with the siege of the embassy and so on. And now, together with the rest of the world, together with all the Security Council powers, a way has been found to come to terms with Iran, and of course that means that US-Iranian relations are going to improve. That's not a surprise, and that's not something the Saudis should regard as hostile to them.
But they do. But they do. That's the point here. If I can go to Eric here, it seems to me, no, I'm agreeing with Oliver, but rationality and foreign policy don't always work, particularly in the Middle East here. Eric, it's because the United States is reaching out to Iran and in some ways, according to some sources, kind of stepping back a little bit. I mean, Saudi Arabia wants to play the role of a spoiler. They're intentionally causing as much trouble as they can with the United States because they know the United States is a captive power. It's wag the dog. Go ahead, Eric.
Yes, well, Prince Walid Talal Al Saud had said, and so too has Prince Bandar, that the issue between the Sauds, basically the Saudi royal family, the Saudi princes, and Shia Islam, particularly Iran, is an existential one. Yeah. And that it essentially, at the end of the day, historically, it will be either death to our dynasty or it will be death to Shia Islam, and specifically to Iran and to, of course, Assad, who is an Alawite Shiite himself, but a secular one.
Yeah, but Eric, if you look at this existential threat, I believe the Saudis believe that, but they want the Americans to do everything for them. They want the Americans to pay for it, the American taxpayer, and to create a lot of trouble for the United States in the Middle East, just because of their belief in this existential threat. It's very irrational when you look at it from what real American foreign policy interests are in the region. They aren't identical with Riyadh. Go ahead.
Well, but they have Washington and Riyadh have another project between them, which is basically taking control of Russia. Russia is the most resource-rich country in the world, largely because of its vast landmass. But in any event, it's not just oil and gas, but it is oil and gas, okay, very, very largely. And the major assets of oil and of gas are Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Qatar.
Okay, Eric, I have to jump in here. We have to go to a break, unfortunately. And after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on those 28 pages. Stay with RT. I love you.
Middle East just started firing tear gas. We've got the election results coming in.
It's hard to squeeze through these crowds.
I'm going to come over here and see if we can shoot. Whoop. Okay.
Fantastic costumes.
Look up.
I want to talk about double standards.
Double standard that there is in Washington.
Russia is responsible for fueling this war.
Assad's war against his own people helped to fuel the rise of ISIL.
By standing up for our values around the world, that is the way that we will keep our own people safe.
How do you get away with such blatant double standards?
We occasionally have to twist the arms of countries that wouldn't do what we need them to do.
There you have it. Simple.
Uncovering hidden stories, moving against the mainstream, going to all lengths to bring real news to Britain. I'm Afshan Ratansi, going underground to bring you the stories that really matter, only on RT.
كنت راغبا في إنتاج فيلم عن الحياة السلمية. غير أن الواقع لا يمكن أن ينخدع. في قلب دمشق لا أحد في مأمن من التفجيرات الإرهابية والقذائف. كل صبح لما بنفيق دائما بنقول إنه منيح لساعتنا إحنا عايشين، منيح لساعتنا مستمرين. يا وطن يا وطن بس يا سوريا.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the possible declassification of 28 pages from the 9/11 report. Okay, I want to present all of our guests a provocative hypothetical. Larry first here. Okay, the Saudis are on their back with the oil price. They are going to have to cut back on their very generous social services, meaning austerity. They've caused a lot of trouble in Yemen. Their policy towards Syria is an absolute mess. And you know what? The kicker is the American people and the two major political parties have come together. This will go down in history. One of the last times, I can't remember the last time it was so bipartisan. This is a chance for regime change in Riyadh. The CIA, they want some reliable people there. It's too important of a country in the region to be left to these people that just see existential threats when in reality they are really phantoms here. What do you think? This is an opportunity. Everything I just said, those 5 points, they point in a direction where people say, yeah, it's time for these guys to go. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's actually a time when the United States has even less influence in order to affect the situation. If you look at what's happened in Yemen, the Saudis have lost militarily in Yemen. And the Houthis have hurt them and hurt them bad. If you go into Saudi Arabia, you have a significant Shia presence in Saudi Arabia. They're the oil workers.
Yep.
So they represent a threat from within. And then when you look within the Saudi royal family itself, it is chaotic. There is no clear path forward for succession. So all of that creates a really very volatile mix. And then you couple that with the fact that the United States is not seen as being willing to really act in a reliable manner with Saudi interests. I think it's a recipe for some real chaos and some real disaster.
I agree. Oliver, what do you take my hypothesis and add on to what Larry said? Go ahead.
I think you're overestimating the importance of America in all this. It's true that Saudi Arabia's got serious problems right now, some of them stemming from the increasing education, the increasing level of sophistication, understanding, information of the population in Saudi Arabia. This creates problems over employment, for example, or we're particularly interested in employment for women, but it applies to men as well. There's a lot of frustration, a lot of feeling that people don't have anywhere to go. The new leadership, King Salman and the Crown Prince and Deputy Crown Prince, and particularly Deputy Crown Prince, Prince Mohammed, are addressing these problems, but whether they'll succeed is another matter. They're talking big about reform programs, and I welcome that. I think that reform programs are needed, but it's one thing to talk about them, and it's another thing to implement them. As you say, they have a problem because of the collapse in the oil price. It's not an imminent problem for Saudi Arabia because they have huge reserves and they can keep going even on a very low oil price for a certain length of time. But in the long term, it is a problem. And whether they'll be able to surmount it is going to be a big issue. But I don't think it's right to see it as a problem of America. It's a problem of Saudi Arabia.
Okay, Eric, I think it's very much a problem for both because it's a very problematic relationship. Interests are diverting. And I would say, I like to reiterate here, if you look at the history of American military relations with Riyadh, the royal family has been very suspicious of its own military because the military is completely or almost completely American trained. And they have CIA connections and whatnot here. They're very suspicious of their great friend, the United States, because the United States at a certain point, like it does on many places of the world, when it decides somebody has to go, somebody has to go. And I don't discount the possibility that will include the royal family of Saudi Arabia. Go ahead, Eric.
Yes, Peter. I take issue and separate my own view from that which has been thus far expressed in this respect. When you refer to Saudi Arabia and you refer to American interests, I think that it's really important to understand that in international affairs, you have interests of contending aristocracies. They're not the publics. Obviously, this is the case in Saudi Arabia, where you have the one family, the Sauds, owning the country. That's basically what you have there. In the United States, however, it also, but to a lesser extent, is the case. In other words, you have to look at the relationships between aristocracies, not between publics. The public interest in the United States, obviously, is for releasing the 28 pages. That goes without question. However, the interests of the U.S. aristocracy are very strongly against that. And the reason is the deep financial relationships between the U.S. aristocracy and the Saud family. Now, the Saud family are the wealthiest family in the world. Forbes does not calculate their wealth because they are heads of state and so forth and so on. They've explained this. However, they do own 100% of Aramco, and Aramco has 260 billion barrels of oil in reserves. That's worth something. The Saud family are worth in the trillions of dollars. All of that wealth is controlled by one man right now, and that is Prince Salman. However, the Saud family are very, very closely interrelated also with the Windsor family. Prince Charles was the person who negotiated the Al Yamama arms deal back under Margaret Thatcher, which was a $160 billion arms deal. He got money from that. That's not reported. The point is that he negotiated that, and he's paid for his services. The point is that you have interrelationships between aristocracies, not interrelationships between publics. And I don't think that it's fair to refer to these countries as if you were talking about the amorphous publics. They really don't.
You have a really good point. You have a really good point here, Larry. Go ahead, jump in, please do.
May I interject something?
Ahead, please do.
I'd just like to, first of all, to say that the idea that Prince Charles negotiated the Yamama arms deal is a fantasy. But second, to go back to your original question, you talked about relations between Saudi Arabia and America as though they have been smooth and unique and calm and prosperous for both sides with no problems in the past. Now, if that had been true, of course, there never would have been an Al Yamama deal. Why did the British and the French get into the Saudi arms market? Because the Americans, if you remember, were refusing to sell their modern equipment to Saudi Arabia under pressure from Israel. And that is an indication of how
I agree
the
with
problems
you.
we're facing today between Saudi...
Good point, and I'm glad you brought it. I don't want to give the impression that this relationship has been seamless. No, there's always problems, even among allies here. But Larry, let me go back to you in Washington.
Right.
I mean, I think we would all agree here that the level of stability in Riyadh, in the royal family, it's something to be very, very concerned about because of the amount of wealth. I mean, it spends more money on the military than Russia does. That's something to think about here. It has a vast military, and you have a family that doesn't know where it wants to go. And we had someone on the program a few months ago saying this new generation with new ideas. And my question was, is Syria their new idea? Is Yemen their new idea? I mean, what I'm getting at is that you have a political elite that is very unstable, but is getting military quite aggressive. That's something you don't usually see from Saudi Arabia. Maybe underground with the supporting Wahhabism and stuff like that around the world, that's one thing. But overt military, we haven't seen that as much. Go ahead, Larry.
Well, the Western mem with respect to Yemen, I think, has been somewhat instructive. It is presented as thus, that Iran is spreading its influence and Iran is funding the Houthis, and the Houthis are rising up and Saudi is pushing back to crush them. Now, the reality is the Houthis have been a problem for centuries, well before Iran was even exerting any influence in that area, number one. Number two, the Saudis launched a military operation against the Houthis, and it's really turned out to be somewhat of a debacle. It's underscored that the Saudis may have a lot of personnel, may have a lot of equipment, but they really don't have a good army. They don't have well-trained soldiers. They don't have a cadre of people who are fighting on behalf of the Saudis. They're much more of a mercenary outfit.
Yeah.
So that is a problem that hangs over them. Their foreign policy has also been somewhat chaotic, and particularly we've seen that they locked in with the Turks to provide weapons to radical Islamists in hopes of pushing out Iranian influence in Syria, replacing Bashar al-Assad and cutting him off from Iranian support. That has backfired. And in fact, that's where Russia and Iran have played a very decisive role in reversing the momentum that had been achieved by ISIS, and ISIS is in the process of retreat. So all of this is coming at a time where the Saudis can't turn to oil resources and say, well, at least our oil's sound. The oil price drop has really created some other issues for them. So it's not a happy time in the kingdom.
Okay, Oliver, at the end of the day, how much of a danger is radical Islam, like the groups that are in Syria, ISIS, and other groups? How much of a threat, at the end of the day, are they to the royal family of Saudi Arabia? Are they going to regret the creation of these groups one day?
Yes, they are a threat. As I said in my first intervention in this discussion, this goes back a long way. The Saudi regime has always been threatened by radical Islam, right back in the days of the Ikhwan in the 1920s, or if you take in the 1970s, the famous raid on the Great Mosque in Mecca. Which was carried out by a group of Islamic extremists, or another example, who murdered King Faisal. It was a prince, a young prince, but what kind of a prince? A prince who had been radicalized. He was a radical Islamist. So this is not a new problem. This is something that is still there. It's a big threat. It could turn into a decisive threat against the Saudi royal family, but they're well aware of that.
Gentlemen, we've run out of time here. You reap what you sow, I would say. Many thanks to my guests in Washington, Oxford, and in Burlington. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules. I love it.